because I've been at this for 20 years and studying the more desperate edge of it, I've oh boy, it almost hurts to say it, but I've really come to accept the inevitability of just about everything.
Yeah.
And then learning how to live within that is challenging, and I find it really hard to talk about, which is why I'm so glad you're doing this conversation. I want to tell one story that happened to me a little over a year ago that was so poignant. But here's what happened: is at the end of the first day of all this teaching, they did an experiment. We'd been together for like 8 hours, and the experiment was you go inside and find some belief that you hold, something that you hold that you don't want. And what they were looking for was kind of personal, interpsychic stuff like, I'm not worthy, or, and I couldn't find one of those, but the thing that came up for me, the belief that I hold is the world will not be okay. So, and because I knew they were going to change it. So what they did, they said, okay, now we want you to just write the opposite. So the opposite for me was the world will be okay. So then they had the group, as a couple hundred of us, one, this side of the room was to be passive, just close your eyes, and the others are going to hug you and speak their new belief into your ear. So, a dozen or 15 people came and hugged me and said their belief. Then it was time to turn. It was my turn. So I went to the first person. I said, the world will be okay. I went to the next one. I said, the world will be okay. And as I said a few more times, I was starting to get into it at a kind of a visceral level. And I hugged the next one. I said, the world will be okay. And her eyes popped open. She looked at me and said, thank you. And I was taken back, and I went to another one, and I said with that same energy, that the world will be okay. And her eyes popped open and looked at me and said, thank you. And it happened several times. And then people started, I kept doing it, and then people started bursting into tears. Bursting into tears at the thought, the world will be okay, spoken in a viscerally authentic way.
Yes.
And I could barely stand it at that point, because there was something, I had tapped into something so deep that by the time, half an hour later, by the time we were out in the car, I just sat and wept while Zoe held me. It's like this secret lives in people at a level that is so painful and so secret. So that's part of why I so appreciate, your work in the world, Michael, and doing this post-doom conversation. We got to talk about it. We got to get it out there.
Hello, Bill.
Hi, Michael. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too again, brother. So the first thing I want to just invite you to share before we get into language and story and all that is just for people who aren't familiar with you and your work, just help us get you. Give a sense of who you've been in the world, what you bring, and what you're particularly passionate about or interested in these days.
Okay. I'm going to be kind of brief. In 1984, I was a feminist therapist because that was the potent energy of change that was going on during that time. And I had been in a men's group, which I just loved a few years before that. And at some point, as I more immersed myself with the feminists during that time, I saw how connected they were. And it just, like a call came over me to do something for men. And once that call came in, I was obsessed. I just had to do something. So I contacted my friend Ron Herring with a PhD in curriculum at the university level, and another guy who was a General Motors guy who had been in the Marine Corps for 10 years, but I had been in groups where I saw his heart so clearly that I invited these two men, and the three of us in the late 84 cobbled together this training, and each of us had a certain genius. So because the three of us were so highly aligned with no hierarchy, this thing just flowed through us, and we launched it in January of 85, and now we're 35 years, we're almost 35 years out, and we've gone around the world. There's 80,000 men, because what the training does is it pops men's hearts open, and in such a safe way, because the container is safe. And I know you've done the training.
Yeah, well, I've found the New Warrior training to be one of the most significant weekend experiences of my entire life, because it brings together so much in terms of psychology and heart energy and an understanding of human nature and an understanding of what has led to healthy cultures in the past. And the hugest piece of it, one of perhaps the most important piece because of the role of testosterone in the human animal's body, is that the men become men by being mentored, often through an ordeal, but there's a rite of passage experience. And the Mankind Project, the New Warrior training has done that more effectively than anything I've personally experienced. I know there's other modalities, other things, but when my son Shane, who's let's see, I'm 60 now and he's 34. When he did it, he also found it to be hugely significant in his life.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I've been deeply immersed. A new novel's come out by a friend of mine on the sacred feminine, and it has moved me to tears. Again, when Zoe and I used to do our workshops, I'd apologize to women very directly, very live for 5,000 years of abuse, and I would always go to tears. There's something just archetypally that moves in me. It's horrible what we've done as men. So the healing of men is profound. I love that I've used my life to do that.
Yeah.
One other detail, just at about 10 years in, I was a founder, and they kept saying that, it took a little while to really launch, but when Bly's book hit in 1990, it sold 1 million copies, and we were already in place. So our work just expanded. Men were suddenly hungry to find something, a safe place where they could express their essence, their emotional authenticity and stuff. And at about 10 years in, they asked me what I wanted as a founder, and I said, I want a seat at the council, I want 1% of my creation, and I want the title Visionary at Large because it sounded so cool. And once they granted that to me, I started taking it really seriously, and I started looking ahead like a visionary would, finding out what's going on in the world, and then bring the word back to my people. And so at the annual meeting, I'd come in and say, I just discovered peak oil. This was maybe 20 years ago. Peak oil, you guys, oh my God, we are probably going to be hurting in a while. And the next year I'd come back and say, remember how bad I said it was last year? It's worse. So eventually I took it on the road with the Sacred Lifeboats tour. And honestly, people just weren't interested back then. I couldn't get a listening. And so I discovered that what they really wanted was community. So I took on the task of building community, and that's what we're into now.
Well, say a little bit about what you and Zoe are doing with regards to that.
Yeah, we've developed a model. There was no model for how men and women can get together and bond and connect and actually be committed to each other like it used to be in the small towns. It's like the memory of that has pretty much been wiped out.
Yeah.
But we wanted it. We wanted that feeling like when you go to a seminar and you just kind of fall in love with everybody and then you say goodbye and you never see them again. We wanted that consistently. So we actually built a tribe here, about 20 people. We call it a tribe. It's kind of like a clan of, subset of tribe, blah, blah, blah. But
yeah,
we do that. We get together and we kind of go to heaven with each other. We fall in love yet again on a regular, like weekly basis. And we've developed a very precise model that we're just developing an e-course right now to take it out far, far broader than our face-to-face seminars.
That's great. Well, Bill, about this sort of term post-doom, just before we started recording this, I started to tell you a story that realized I hadn't told maybe once or twice at the most, but it's a fun story how this came to us. Connie and I had been speaking in Eastern Canada, and we did a whole bunch of programs, including a week-long retreat for clergy on sort of ecology as the heart of theology, that sort of thing. And Connie was talking to a journalist who had just finished, Zach St. George, who's just finishing up a book for Norton Press on assisted migration, assisting trees in migrating north, which is one of Connie's big passions. And at the end of the email, the very end of the email, she said, yeah, we just finished doing this retreat for clergy. And, we gave them a lot of doom, but there's only so much doom you can give ministers because they have to go into their congregations and, preach and teach and whatever. So she said, pretty quickly, we got to a post-doom place. And, post-doom has a gorgeous sunrise, period. End of email. And she read this aloud to me. I was like, post-doom has a gorgeous sunrise? That's kick butt. I mean, I like that. So then like 2 days later, we had actually spent the better part of a day with Paul Beckwith, who does these amazing videos on the Arctic and other things. And Paul Chafurka, who has been sort of like this major writer, his Approaching the Limits blog. And so Connie and I, and the two of them, Paul Chfurka and Paul Beckwith, spent like 5 hours together. And so we bounced this idea of a post-doom conversation series off them, and they both thought it was great. So that was the genesis of this idea.
Beautiful. The post-doom conversation works for me.
Yeah.
And trying to make friends, it works for them also.
Yes, exactly. Although it's interesting because when I reached out to John Michael Greer to invite him, he said, well, post-doom doesn't do much for me. I mean, he's so gets the rise and fall of civilizations, that doom is just not an accurate term. But so I'm curious well, first of all, what comes to your mind when you hear post-doom? And then perhaps separate from that, how do you speak of a contracting or collapsing time? How do you speak of these times?
Yeah, I don't speak about it much because there's just still not much of a listening. And, John Michael Greer was one of my original friends, and then in alignment with all this, he used to live in Ashland.
Oh, right, of course.
Get together and have these long conversations about this stuff. Because I've been at this for 20 years and, studying the more desperate edge of it, oh boy, it almost hurts to say it, but I've really come to accept the inevitability of just about everything.
Yeah.
And then learning how to live within that is challenging. And I find it really hard to talk about, which is why I'm so glad you're doing this conversation. I want to tell one story that happened to me a little over a year ago that was so poignant. But here's what happened: is at the end of the first day of all this teaching, they did an experiment. We'd been together for like 8 hours, and the experiment was you go inside and find some belief that you hold, something that you hold that you don't want. And what they were looking for was kind of personal, interpsychic stuff like, I'm not worthy, or and I couldn't find one of those, but the thing that came up for me, the belief that I hold is the world will not be okay. So, because I knew they were going to change it. So what they did, they said, okay, now we want you to just write the opposite. So the opposite for me was the world will be okay. So then they had the group, as a couple hundred of us, one, this side of the room was to be passive, just close your eyes, and the others are going to hug you and speak their new belief into your ear. So, a dozen or 15 people came and hugged me and said their belief. Then it was time to turn. It was my turn. So I went to the first person. I said, the world will be okay. I went to the next one. I said, the world will be okay. And as I said a few more times, I was starting to get into it at a kind of a visceral level. And I hugged the next one. I said, the world will be okay. And her eyes popped open. She looked at me and said, thank you. And I was taken back, and I went to another one, and I said, with that same energy, that the world will be okay. And her eyes popped open and looked at me and said, thank you. And it happened several times. And then people started, I kept doing it, and then people started bursting into tears. Bursting into tears at the thought, the world will be okay, spoken in a viscerally authentic way.
Yes. And
I could barely stand it at that point, because there was something, I had tapped into something so deep that by the time, half an hour later, by the time we were out in the car, I just sat and wept while Zoe held me. It's like this secret lives in people at a level that is so painful and so secret. So that's part of why I so appreciate, your work in the world, Michael, and doing this post-doom conversation. We got to talk about it. We got to get it out there.
Well, I can't think of a more apt tagline or motto or whatever for post-doom than the world will be okay. So thanks, brother. I appreciate it. I'm sure Connie will title this conversation, the world will be okay.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you didn't always have that. And in fact, it took a long time. There's two questions. One, I want you to just share a little bit about the challenges of being so far ahead of so many people and the frustration of trying to talk about this stuff for the last 20 years or longer. But then also, sort of wrapped into that, your story. I mean, those of us that were born in the 20th century, mid 20th century, early to mid 20th century, we grew up with certain expectations, certain assumptions about the future. And at some point, either gradually or suddenly, those shifted. And there's often a lot of emotion that has come with that. So take as long as you want, but this is really the heart of this particular podcast series or conversation series is your journey, your story of going from however it was you grew up to wherever you are now, and especially some of the key points along the way.
Mm-hmm. Boy, I'm just an astonishingly ordinary guy. I grew up in a little town in the Midwest, and the miracles happened, and I, managed to get into graduate school and and into men's work, and then I've already shared that story of how that happened.
But when you began doing that in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I mean, even early 90s, there wasn't really that much awareness of climate. I mean, Bill McKibben's book wasn't written until the end of the 80s. And there wasn't really, there weren't a lot of people who were thinking in terms of the end of the world as we know it. There wasn't a lot of people that were thinking of climate and ecological catastrophe or whatever.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. There's a piece that goes back really, really early. It goes back 37, 38 years ago. There's a friend of mine in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who she was tapped into stuff. She was with the Association for Psychology, and she came to me as a friend and she said, Bill, I have just heard something from an Australian physician named Helen Caldicott about the medical consequences of nuclear war, and I'm really concerned. And we're going to have this conference, and I think there's going to be a video of her. And so I went, and at her suggestion, because I knew she cared, I stood at the back of the room, and when the video was going on, I had my arms folded like, okay, show me. So Helen Caldicott started talking about the medical consequences of nuclear war, and next thing I know, the tears are streaming down my face, and it struck me. It was like there was a bit of a call in that. And then, kind of one of the young feminist writers, and I can't think of her name right now, but she wrote an article in which basically said, the world is in some significant danger, and it's really men's fault. And for some reason, I did not go into defend, maybe because I'd been in men's group.
Yeah, right.
And so it was like there's something in me getting activated around working with men. So when I was at this feminist conference I was alluding to, and the call came in, I have to do something for men.
Yes.
Those are I already knew the world was in danger at that point, and I knew largely it was men, from the patriarchy. I've talked about that, the 5,000 years, that were, putting us in that danger. So to empower men was my intention. So it was from those keys that I started doing the men's work. And I didn't really learn about climate change till some years later. And that, as a visionary, I started studying that stuff in the early peak oil and taking it on the road and finding the astonishing lack of people really wanting to hear it. There's another flip to that, just like the story I told about those people I was hugging. I honestly think that people know this stuff and have known it for a really long time. And it's just, we haven't had the courage to talk about it or really out it, and that's why, like John Michael and you and some of the other pioneers in actually talking about this has been important. Carolyn Baker and that whole bunch.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've got a theory about that. I think it's largely as a result of the fact that at some deep level, they know it, but at some deep level, they also know that we are embedded in patriarchal, industrial, rapacious, human-centered, capitalistic systems that are not going to, we're not going to be able to change, or certainly not be able to make any significant change to avert the catastrophe coming. So if you know something, but you also know at some deep level, there's not a damn thing you can do about it, then the psychic pressure to deny, or at least to deny the worst of it, is going to be almost inevitable, almost compelling. Most people are not going to be able to move through denial. And that's, I think the biggest part of it is that we also know that there's no way to turn this around we're not going to go from radically unsustainable to sustainable in a generation or two, or without some serious collapse first?
One of the guys on your list, Dave, who lives up in the Canadian islands there.
Oh, Dave Pollard.
Dave Pollard. Oh my God.
Yes,
I forget
yes.
his name. I love his stuff. I've been following his stuff for so long, and he used to be like a corporate guy, and so he knows that the systems from within. And he says so clearly, he says large complex systems simply don't change. They can't change. They must collapse.
Yes.
So knowing that, I have that thing that you just talked about also, like. There's nothing else that can happen. We're in that track.
Right. Yeah. I interviewed Dave as part of this series, and he's awesome. I mean, I first encountered his work just maybe 3 years ago, and it featured some of his writings in some sermons that I've done.
Oh, good.
I just found it so valuable. Yeah. Well, so anything else? I mean, I want you to flesh out a little bit more your story of how you came to an understanding of overshoot, of collapse, of resource depletion, all these challenges. Anything more that you want to share about how it's been for you processing that and the frustrations of the challenges in finding so little receptivity on the part of others in sharing this, and how did you deal with that?
Yes, that's a good one. I've come through this for so long, it's been literally decades of kind of, finding it. And then, Guy McPherson comes through, and he's this screaming in the wilderness. I drove all the way to Shasta just to meet this guy to see if he was credible. And unfortunately he is credible as a guy saying stuff. And so I held that for a while. And then within the last 2 years, now you know this, Michael, there's even been spiritual teachers that have been coming out and saying the same thing. So there's, it's gone from a whisper to almost a scream at this point. And it's validating something that I've known. And I've gone through my own grief process, my own, what really rips me up, of course, is, I'm getting to be a pretty old guy. I've lived an awfully full life, but I look at the kids, I look at the babies, and it just breaks my heart,
Yes.
Because, just because, you know what they're going to go through. And I feel powerless. I feel helpless. So there's a lot of grief in that for me.
Yes.
I feel pretty consistently.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to have a heart of compassion and not feel grief and at times anger and despair. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, for me personally, this conversation series, talking with folks like yourself who have often been studying this stuff, learning it, trying to share it, often frustrating at the response for a long, long time, and yet things that limits to growth predicted in 1972, things that Catton knew well in 1980 when he published Overshoot. Joanna Macy knew this stuff decades ago. I mean, there's so many people who have held an open heart and tried to awaken others. And many of us have shifted from where we genuinely, at some point in time in the past, genuinely did believe that we could shift the systems in time.
Yeah. Yep.
And now the recognition that that's not the case, there's a whole different wave of coming to be with that.
Yeah. I just, Charles Eisenstein is coming to mind. I just saw a little flash. He's going to actually do a little interview with us for our tribe work. And his new book on climate is typical of his work. He so will not abide by us finding an enemy or hate, because that's just stepping back into the old paradigm that's caused what we've got right now. And he recently wrote a beautiful piece on the Amazon that touched a lot of hearts about, it's so easy to blame the politicians or whoever's starting the fires. So I kind of see that as the leading edge of a kind of a spiritual hopefulness. There really is. If I were to really stretch and go for some hope, it's the exponential awakening thesis, and there's some lovely spiritual folks talking about that in a good way, and grounded in Rupert Sheldrake's resonant fields,
morphogenetic fields, right?
There's something there. If I was to stretch and find something.
Yeah, I was there at one time. I'm no longer there, partly because I've become convinced through my study of Toynbee and Spengler and Vico and the people who study civilizations side by side by side by side and look at the common patterns. And one of the most expected that you can absolutely count on in declining civilizations is a growing number of people who believe with all their might that if we all just believe this way, hold this view, a transformation in consciousness, and it's never happened yet, and yet it's so predictable that people will believe that.
Well, I've been reading Meg Wheatley's new book, and she's got the whole first section is on, the study of a dozen different empires that all collapsed along precisely the same 6 levels, same 6 steps, all of them. And the American empire, is in the 6th step so obviously, so overtly right now.
Yes. Anybody watching or listening to this conversation that Bill and I are having, I highly recommend a little 75-page book by William Ophuls called Immoderate Greatness: Why Civilizations Fail. He sums up an entire library of research, a mountain of research on the collapse of previous civilizations in 6 little chapters in this amazing book, Immoderate Greatness: Why Civilizations Fail. And he also quotes at length Sir John Glubb, Glubb Pasha, in his 1975 or 1976 monograph called, oh gosh, what was the title of it? The Fate of Empires and the Survival of something or other, I forget. Connie, when she edits this, she'll add that image. And then just Luke Kemp in the BBC just last February came out with this amazing feature article in the BBC titled, Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse? And he actually takes a look at 88 civilizations and he charts them. He has a chart that shows all 88 civilizations, how long they lasted. And this was just between 4,000 BCE and 1,000 of the Common Era. So a 5,000-year period. He doesn't look beyond 4,000 BC, and he doesn't look at the last 1,000 years. So the number is actually over 100. And he also basically pulls out some of the most common patterns. So it's amazing to see just in recent times all this coming together of what we know. And yeah, the challenging part is when you really get it, then you realize, oh, the political insanity of the last, several years, right on schedule.
Right on schedule.
The economic insanity unraveling, right on schedule. And that's why I love John Michael Greer's book, Dark Age America, so profoundly.
That's right. You read the whole thing, remember?
I read the galley. He sent the galley to me. And I was so impressed with the book that I called up New Society publishers. I called up John Michael Greer and I said, hey, listen, this book is way too important to not be available in audio. I don't want any money, pro bono, put me in a studio, let me record this. And I did. And of course, what he does is he applies everything that we've learned over hundreds of years of research, why civilizations contract and fall, and then applies that to North America in the next 500 years. If abrupt climate change doesn't do us in the next 50 years, here's what we can expect in North America in the next 500 years based on previous collapsing civilizations. And the book is genius. I just love it. And
I had found it autonomously. That was one of those intimacies that we shared. We find these things and then you and I share this stuff. Hey, so I'm going to do the interview now for a while. So I've got another thesis, another hopeful thesis that I've been playing with. They're getting a little thin. It's hard to find them. But I just love the fact that the crop circles have been talking to us for the last 30 or 40 years and getting incrementally more complex in what they're communicating to us. And the UFO stuff is still just hanging out there. It seems credible if you read the certain folks. And the story that the UFOs were hanging out over the nuclear silos and shutting them down tells me, if I were to get really, really hopeful, that they won't let something really horrible happen to us because we're part of or they seeded us. Okay, talk to me. I have no idea how to deal with any of that because I've not been exposed to what I would consider really credible stuff around UFOs or around crop circles. But hey, I am such a bow of respect. Whatever the hell gives somebody a sense of hope or inspiration, that go for it, brother. It's a long shot, but I kind of like
it. If that works for you, go for it.
Okay, I thought it could be.
Oh, well, okay. So I know another mentor that you and I share in common is Joanna Macy. And she constantly comes back to not only the importance of grief work, Despair and Empowerment was her first book related to that, but also in terms of the big picture and how reminding ourselves of the big picture can help us really look at the intensely scary, terrifying and depressing and, stuff, but ultimately come to the place of the world will be okay.
Hmm.
So how has her work and Thomas Berry's work, how has the Epic of Evolution, Brian Swim, others who show this big picture perspective, how, if at all, has that informed you or helped you in this journey?
I don't really have an answer for that. I appreciate the bigger picture, and I'm able to live in it and sometimes live from it. And and I'm still living in this sense of catastrophe and making do with it as best as I can.
Yeah. The main way it does for me is I paint out a 100-year timeline, and on a cosmic century timeline, if the whole universe is 100 years, of course, Homo habilis was a week ago, Homo sapiens, the last day. And even if we last another 2 or 3 million years before a super volcano or a asteroid or something takes us out, that's only a week or two. And so on the cosmic time frame, species come and go, and so that allows me to relax into life's time, life's nature. And that's one of the things that helps me trust that everything will be okay, that the world will be okay, is because we will go extinct. No question. No mammal our size lasts for more than 10 or 12 million years at most. Usually it's half that or less.
Yeah.
And knowing that allows me to trust that bigger picture. So that's where I find some help.
Yeah, that's good. I was watching an Adyashanti piece in which he was talking about the deep importance of being able to hold the extinction possibility. Because if you don't hold that, then you shut down, then you got this, the edges again, which is where suffering comes from. So anyway, so bless you again for bringing this forward as an authentic possibility that we wrestle with.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I'm really standing on the shoulder of others who have been doing this kind of work. I mean, the people who really inspired this first and foremost were Jem Bendell and his deep adaptation paper, and so much stuff that's come after that. And then Catherine Ingram and her Facing Extinction paper. That was awesome. And then Dahr Jamail and Barbara Cecil and their incredible truth outposts. And so those 4 people were really the inspiration, because they provided such a way of holding even the inevitability of human extinction, but even the possibility that could be in the not too distant future. But then we rob it of its power by being at peace with it. And then we can do the work that we can make, where we can make whatever difference at whatever scale, without being in freak out mode or denial mode or anger mode or whatever.
Yeah, I think Jem Bendell catalyzed Extinction Rebellion, which is apparently is growing dramatically. I went to their website and looked at all the sites around the planet where it's getting juice.
Very much so. And in fact, I just interviewed just maybe 2 weeks ago, and Connie just uploaded it, I think yesterday, my conversation with Rupert Read, who's massively involved in, he's up there with Catherine Ingram and Jem Bendell and Barbara and Dahr in terms of both stature and in terms of his whole approach is, this civilization is finished. And the conversation itself is so organized and so inspiring. And he's massively involved in Extinction Rebellion. Well, so let me ask a question related to time, but looking past. Okay. Many of us have had to restory the past as well as the future in coming to terms with all this. And I'm curious, do you have any if-onlys? Like, if only humanity had done this by this time, or if we only had not taken this path by this time, or maybe it even goes deeper than humanity. So are there any if-onlys for you, or is there a sense of inevitability that any species that had tool-making use would have gone this path?
I've been studying Matt Kahn's work for the last 6 years. You know, every Sunday we get together and listen to one of his tapes. Last Sunday, the whole thing was on blame and how utterly useless and silly blame is, and how it takes us into where we don't want to be. It's one of the essence of suffering. And I've kind of lived there for a long time. So I've got an infinite number of if onlys, but they're just kind of academically interesting.
Yes, exactly.
I don't
Exactly.
get emotionally engaged in them anymore.
Believe me, I can share that sentiment. I mean, it is interesting. One person actually can at times in human history, especially if the timing's right, can make an enormous difference. And so, yeah.
You know, in the deep metaphysics, it couldn't be another way. You know that. It's so. I think I've come to live there.
Yeah, yeah. Harvey Jackins, I think, the founder of co-counseling, reevaluation counselor. I forget who it was. I was having a conversation with somebody in this series recently who mentioned that with respect to the past, it's just useful to assume that it was determined. It couldn't have been otherwise.
That's the one.
And with respect to the future, it's useful to assume that our choices can make a difference. You know, I like that.
Yeah. I can go either way on that one. Honestly, I've been playing with the determination in both directions lately. So.
Oh God. See, I don't even know what to do with that. It's kind of, again, it's one of these things that are fascinating to contemplate. And from a metaphysical perspective, I was like, well, that's cool. But,
like no matter what we do, it's going to happen the way it's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So related to impermanence and death, for many of us, having an understanding of death as inevitable, as sacred, as no less sacred than life. I remember John Michael Greer said one thing. I love the fact that you have history with him in Ashland as well. But he said that death is not the opposite of life. Death is an integral part of life. The opposite of life is space. And I thought, wow, the opposite of life is space. I mean, you can't get more sterile and unalive than space. So I thought that was fascinating. But anyway, so how do you hold impermanence and death in a way that nourishes you in these challenging times?
I kind of think I've made peace with death a while back. And and doing it in a good way just still feels like a challenge. It's part of why I've got a lot of energy around tribe, like birth and marriage and all those things that call for ceremony of blessing and completion. It sure seems like doing death in a good way requires a tribe. It requires a group of people that really care about you, got your back, and going to take care of you all the way. So that's my sense. And
I'm so grateful. Nobody else has voiced anything like that yet. And that is so right on in my own experience. I mean, that's my sense of why indigenous cultures that were able to live sustainably in a way that didn't defile and destroy everything they depended upon is that they had an intimate community, not just with themselves, but with their descendants and their ancestors. There was that sense of cherishing. I mean, it's called ancestor worship by rather stupid Western anthropologists. It's not ancestor worship. It's honoring the voices, the wisdom of the past, and having a personal relationship to them in your imagination, in your heart, and in your conversation.
so important.
And in the same way, it's having an imaginary conversation in a real, personal, intimate way with your descendants. Without doing that, we're not likely to live in a way that genuinely is sustainable. We're going to allow the present to defile and toxify the future. We're unaccountable to the future. I've come to see, or my interpretation of the difference between sustainable and unsustainable is sustainability is accountability to the future.
Ooh,
and the past. And unsustainable is being unaccountable to the future and the past.
In my local elders lodge, we always welcome the ancestors. We always bring them in to be with us and honor them, and then release them at the end. And there's something about getting older, and then the elders in my elders lodge, we talk a lot about death as one of the things we allow it to be part of it. And it seems as I'm getting older, I'm honestly feeling far less afraid of death. Just
Yeah.
he's like part of the journey.
Yes. Well, Connie used to do, both of us used to do programs on death, sort of a
Yeah.
sacred approach to death that's grounded in science for many, many years. And I remember her telling this story of when she was in a class of grade school kids. And just by languaging it, it made a difference. She said, how many of you have already had a grandparent who's become an ancestor?
Oh,
Now, notice that way, not how many of you have had a grandparent that died.
yeah.
How many of you have had a grandparent that's already become an ancestor? And kids, excitedly, my grandma became an ancestor last year. There's that sense that you become something. You become a revered ancestor. I love that.
Somebody once referred to what ancestors in training. Part of what we're doing as conscious elders.
Yes, ancestors in training. Wow, I love that one. Yeah, wait, Barbara Cecil and I know you know her as well. Barbara and I interviewed Stephen Jenkinson just about 2 weeks ago. That was great. So last two questions, one related to gifts. So have you found on the other side of the post-doom door or whatever, like on the other side of grief and, depression and all that, what we've all cycled and felt, what gifts have you found on that other side?
Yeah, just a sense of, kind of peace and completion. And, I can almost measure it by my need to not talk about it. It's like I've internalized it sufficiently that I don't need to convince anybody.
Yes, yes.
And give my gift more and more. That's why we're doing this, putting an enormous amount of work and taking our tribe training out into the world as an online course. So it's giving my gift.
That's great. And since you've mentioned that a couple of times, I don't want to wait till just the end. How does somebody learn more about, somebody hearing this or reading or viewing this conversation, how would they learn more about your tribe work?
We believe it is so time for tribe. So our website is timefortribe.com.
Yep, that's great. Cool. Well, Bill, last question I want to ask, and then we can just go wherever we want, but remaining opportunities. So I'm curious, what's your take on what's beyond our control and where we still can make a difference individually or collectively? In other words, what's your sense of what's no longer possible, but what still is possible?
Making peace with ourselves. And boy, I still honestly, I want to jump back to that business about, reclaiming. One of the spiritual teachers was saying that she sees this as, a time where it's happening more and more, faster and faster, the quickening, more and more people are waking up. And the pressure of the situation is actually forcing people to a place where they're actually waking up more and more. I like that. I like that. Feels right, and I'm holding it. But thanks to you now, I don't hold it too deep.
Well, no, it's useful. It's what David Sloan Wilson calls practical truth.
Sure.
That by holding that as a truth, it inspires your life and helps you on a day-by-day basis. That's practical truth. And we need a lot more of that in the world, it seems to me.
Versus faith, which Carl Sagan says is a belief in the absence of compelling evidence.
Yeah, well, where that line is, who knows? I see faith as trust. Trusting reality for me is what faith in God is supposed to mean. Trusting reality.
Messing with a minister here.
Yeah, right, exactly. So anything else in terms of where you think we might still be able to make a difference individually and collectively, and what's beyond our control?
No, I like everybody from Guy McPherson on forward has said, do something, get active, don't just be passive. And yes, we need to have our bodies and mind and our communities active and doing something that feels right, even though it may seem hopeless at some level. Get on, do what you got to do right now. Do what you can do.
Yes, exactly.